Chapter 5 Everything Changes. But one spring day, everything changed for Hachiko. That morning, like always, Professor Ueno walked to the station with his dog and then patted his head, said goodbye, and went in. Hachiko walked home and jumped over the gate into the yard. That day, the dog stayed near Mrs. Ueno when she put the clothes on the washing line in the yard, and when she went into the house, he stayed near the door. It was a warm day, and Hachiko slept. But he listened to the noises from the house too. That day was different, and Hachiko knew it. Again and again that morning he barked, and when Mrs. Ueno heard him, she came into the yard. "There is nobody at the gate," she said. "Why are you barking?" In the evening, Hachiko jumped over the gate, went to the station, and sat and waited for the professor. When the professor's usual train arrived, and people walked out of the station, Hachiko stood and wagged his tail. But his master did not come. So he sat and waited again. More trains came into the station, and when they arrived, Hachiko stood and watched the people carefully, but he did not see his master. Hachiko waited and waited, and in the end, at about midnight, he walked home. When he arrived, he jumped over the gate, went to the door of the house, and barked. Mrs. Ueno slowly came out into the dark yard. She put her hand on Hachiko's warm coat for a long time. Then she began to cry and said, "Your master isn't coming home, Hachiko. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. He's never coming back." She went into the house and she called the dog. "You can sleep in the house tonight, Hachiko," she said quietly. But Hachiko looked at her and did not move. He wanted to stay in the yard, so she said, "Good night, Hachiko," and closed the door. When my father told me the news about Professor Ueno, he came and sat next to me and took my hand. "Professor Ueno had a bad heart," he told me. "He died suddenly at the university yesterday. It's very sad. Professor Ueno was a good man." I cried a lot that day. I cried for the kind professor and his wife, and I cried for Hachiko. I did not go to the yakitori stall that evening. I stayed at home with my mother. But when my father came home, I heard him. He told my mother, "I saw Hachiko this evening. He went to the station at 6:05 and waited there for his master for hours and hours. When a train came in, he stood up and wagged his tail." "Oh, poor Hachiko," my mother said. "I went and saw him before I left," my father told her. "I said, Go home, Hachiko. He isn't coming. I'm sorry. But he didn't go home. Every evening after that, when we were at our stall, we saw Hachiko. He arrived at the station at 6:05. He sat and waited. And when the train arrived and people came out of the station, he stood and watched. It's very sad, people said when they saw him.